So now that the war has truly concluded, we're going to need a treaty to officially bring it to an end. Now, once we have success in Cuba and in Puerto Rico, the United States has really demonstrated something about itself. What we're going to see is that we have just faced off against an old European power, and the United States has come out on top very clearly. What the Treaty of Paris is going to say is that now that the old world European power has been so thoroughly defeated, the United States is basically going to take its spot as one of the world powers. Now, when the US and Spain officially sign this treaty, it's going to really show that the war itself really was not even close. The United States just routed Spain within this war. The war itself really only took 15 weeks. But in those 15 weeks, most of it was simply travel time. It was crossing the Pacific with the new American fleet. The actual war itself only lasts really a handful of weeks, in that the United States shows so much just overwhelming power against this old world Spanish fleet that really there's no comparison. This really ushers in the new world of industry, and the United States is going to prove to be one of the leaders of that new world. Now, as we've kind of talked about before, the way that industry changes the world is kind of just hard to wrap your mind around until you really see it in action. What we've really demonstrated with this huge victory is that the United States is going to be really much still on the rise, that we are really ascending into a major world power, that our technology and our industry is simply going to place us among the leaders in the world. Now, the Spanish were ill prepared for this. They were still trying to fight an old world kind of war with these wooden ships powered by sail. The United States is going to prove to have one of the best navies in the world. Now, I should say this as well. It is still very limited. It's not a huge industrialized navy as far as numbers go. The American military has a long tradition of expanding very quickly when a war begins and then shrinking back down once the war is over. Even though the United States shows that we're very powerful and that we have a brand new steel navy, it doesn't even necessarily compare to what other European nations are going to be doing. They're going to be building on a massive scale, and if the United States wants to keep up, we're going to have to continue expanding the military. Now, again, that is kind of contradictory to the American military experience of really expansion and contraction. But what we've really demonstrated with this war is that we can compete with the Europeans. In fact, this old European power has just been routed by the United States, and the other European powers are going to take note. They can see that the United States very much is ascending as we're going to take our spot as a world power and now an empire. What Spain is going to agree to is to dismantle their previous ideas of re-energizing their Western empire. Spain's going to sign over the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. Now you can see on the map that they are outlined within this. Cuba and Puerto Rico are going to be nice pieces of the empire, but they're only going to be pieces of a much larger scale. We're also going to receive Guam, which is not labeled on this map, as Guam is really just this tiny little island in the middle of the Pacific. Now, we're going to talk more about the bigger plans for Guam, as it's a stepping stone on the way across the Pacific. But we also are going to acquire the Philippines. Now, we talked about the Philippines earlier, about how their geostrategic importance really comes with their proximity to China. The Philippines are going to be an American colony for years, as they are going to be, as they're going to allow access to the great Chinese market. Now, we're going to talk more about that going forward. However, to make this legal and to make it really in line with some of the New World ideas of purchasing what is going to be taken after a war is concluded, the United States is going to buy these islands from Spain for $20 million in 1898. Now, just to kind of give you a comparison, that's roughly about $500 million in today's dollars. But what this purchase and victory in this war is going to finally create is America becomes an empire. Now, we sort of talked about before how if you're going to be on the world stage in 1898, in the turn of the century, you need colonies. You need to expand. The Europeans are well far ahead of us. They have a 400-year head start on us. This is just simply the United States ascending in power. Now, I conclude this by really saying, well, what's been gained here? We have this massive rout of the Spanish, of this old world European monarchy. And what we need to look at is really how this kind of shows the United States in several different lights. Now, first off, what we're going to acquire from this are stepping stones on the way to China. We had talked about how really the great prize of the imperialism game is China. The Europeans have been trying to access and colonize in China for years before this. China has something that really every major industrial power wants, and it's just a huge population. It's a massive market. It's people that don't necessarily have finished goods. They don't have industry like the Europeans or the Americans do. What China represents is really just an opportunity to sell these goods. Now, we're going to talk more about how we need a larger market in just a moment. But in order to get across the Pacific, you need to have refueling stations. The Pacific is simply so vast, it's so huge, that travel across it is going to take time. Now, in doing so, most ships of this era don't have the fuel capacity to simply fuel in the United States and cross the entire Pacific. You can't do it. So you need to have friendly harbors in order to refuel. This is going to be really what the acquisition of the Philippines and Guam and even Hawaii is going to provide for the United States. This is where you can place huge dumps of fuel in order to, in fact, get your ships across the Pacific on their way to China. These refueling stations are going to be necessary, and they expand the American projection of power all the way across the Pacific. Now, next is we're going to achieve international prestige. We've been talking about how if you want to be a world power, you have to compete with the Europeans. And the Europeans have been colonizing for years and years before this, 400 years plus. If we are going to take our spot as a world power, we need an empire. Now, I need to say this. The United States and our empire is going to be considerably different from what the Europeans have done for years. We talked really at the very beginning of this how when the Spanish were at their peak, when they controlled really all of Central America into South America, their idea of empire was to simply just gobble up really precious metals for the most part. They wanted to simply just take all the natural resources they could and then cut and run. The United States idea of imperialism is considerably different. It's more of a long-term kind of business idea. Now, this is really going to be based on the way that the British are going to colonize as well. The Brits were not interested in cutting and running like the Spanish were. They saw their colonies as a very long-term investment, as a business venture. The United States kind of follows this idea and sees their colonies, although short-lived, as really a business investment. We become a world power in that we have our colonies in the Caribbean and throughout the Pacific, but those colonies serve a purpose of really bringing or really expanding American power into places where it had never been before. We are going to elevate ourselves to the level of the Europeans, even though really at this point we've only been a nation for roughly 100 years. The Europeans have a huge head start on us, and we have become what were once just these upstart British colonies ourselves into one of the major industrial powers in the world. Now also, we are going to achieve raw materials. During the late 1800s into the early 1900s, if you're going to be an industrial power, you need to have the raw materials in order to drive that. Now, we've talked about in the past how you need to have iron and steel, you need to have coal, you need to have oil. What we're going to see with our colonies is, yes, they do provide us with some other natural resources, some raw materials necessary for an industrial power. But these islands are very small and they're very much limited in those raw materials. What the United States will get out of these colonies in regards to raw materials is simply minuscule to the other side of this. What an industrial power also needs from colonies is they need new markets. They need more people to buy their finished goods. What we're going to see in Cuba, in Guam, and Puerto Rico, and the Philippines is, yes, there are more people to buy American goods. It does open up more markets, but they are very limited compared to the great prize of the imperialism game. These colonies allow us access to China. Millions upon millions of people who have yet to really be introduced to finished goods. This is really kind of the end game, is access to China. Millions upon millions of people to buy American goods. And finally, what we are going to gain out of this is an expansion of manifest destiny. Now, we had talked about earlier, too, how we need to tweak our definition of manifest destiny because we've reached the Pacific. We have gone from Atlantic to Pacific. We've brought these things about America. Now that we've made it to that point, we want to expand even further. We want to bring democracy. We want to bring civilization. We want to bring technology to other places in the world. We have truly liberated these islands from a Spanish monarchy that had really just limited them for years before this. The United States is still expanding democracy, as it's very possible that Puerto Rico is going to become a state very shortly.